It's impossible to understand the origins of World War I without looking backward, not just to the alliance system that produced it, which set Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire against Britain, France, and Russia, but to forces unleashed a century earlier, specifically by the French Revolution. And of all the legacies of the French Revolution, the clash between left and right, the triumph and subversion of the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, perhaps the most important is the idea of nationalism. This term, which can be broadly defined as loyalty to an imagined national community, did not begin with the Revolution, but revolutionary upheaval rapidly magnified its importance. The young French men who enlisted to defend the Revolution did so in the name of the nation, a people's community bound not by loyalty to a king, but devotion to each other. And as French armies rampaged across Western and Central Europe, their opponents too began to rally in defense of the nation, fighting to defend Spain, Germany, Britain, or Russia. When peace finally arrived in 1815, victory celebrations offered a chance to lavishly display national pride. Parades, pageants, and floats extolled the bravery and self-sacrifice of one's fellow citizens, and in the ensuing decades, all parties to the conflict funded monuments to the dead. In Britain, where national pride long predated the French Revolution, soaring monuments like Nelson's Column in London celebrated victory over Napoleon. In France, pride in Napoleon's accomplishments persisted even after his defeat, with monuments like the Arc de Triomphe, begun by Napoleon to commemorate his victory at Austerlitz in 1805, becoming potent symbols of the nation. In both cases, national pride was politically uncomplicated, at least domestically. British and French patriots had a state they could call their own. Both states were relatively homogeneous, possessing common languages and shared political cultures. Neither was completely unified. The United Kingdom was, after all, a union between England, Scotland, and Ireland, with nationalism in the latter leading to war and revolution, but neither state was afflicted with the linguistic and cultural divisions that marked much of the rest of the world. It was there where nationalism got rather complicated. For nation-states like Britain and France, sovereign countries claiming to represent a nation, nationalism was a unifying force for its citizens. But in multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire, nationalism was a destabilizing force, one that would doom both to extinction in the 20th century. Linguistic and cultural boundaries rarely reflected state or even provincial borders. German was spoken in more than a dozen Central European states, from Prussia in the north to Bavaria in the south. Italian was widely spoken in the Italian peninsula, but as the Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich put it, Italy was but a geographical expression. There was an imagined Italian nation, bound by language and culture, but Italy was divided into a number of different states. But for a growing chorus of nationalists, scholars like Giuseppe Mazzini, the idea that one's nation had no state of its own was unacceptable. Italian nationalists dreamt of uniting the various Italian principalities into a single nation-state, one centered on the ancient capital of Rome. German nationalists had much the same vision, hoping to unify the patchwork of German principalities into a single state. This was easy enough when the vast majority of people in any specific region spoke the same language and shared a common culture. When German unification did arrive in 1871, the Kingdom of Bavaria's incorporation into the new German Reich annoyed the King of Bavaria, who was so upset at his loss of power that he built the romantic castle at Neuschwanstein to alleviate his sorrow, but it carried broad support among German speakers in the region. But in Polish-speaking Silesia and Eastern Germany, belonging to a German nation-state was not nearly as welcome. Poles had no state of their own, Poland having been divided between Prussia, Austria, and Russia at the end of the 18th century. None of those powers had any incentive to allow Poles their own state, and expressions of Polish nationalism, even the publication of Polish-language newspapers or teaching Polish history, was seen as subversive and banned. Such expressions would not have been a problem prior to the 19th century. In the Austrian Empire, which possessed a German-speaking elite and a host of other groups, including Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenes, Hungarians, Poles, and so on, no one group constituted a majority. The state was bound by loyalty to the person of the monarch, and the state made few other demands on its subjects. They could speak whatever language they wanted so long as they paid taxes on time. But then German speakers began demanding that German-speaking regions be unified with Germany. Hungarian speakers began demanding their own state, and Czechs and Slovaks began demanding autonomy within the empire. There was no explicit Austrian nationalism, at least not one that could compete with these countervailing pressures. And while Germans in Austria-Hungary demanded recognition as Germans, their neighbors might be Czech or Slovak, and there was no way one could draw boundaries that would satisfy every group. As we consider the conflicts that gave rise to World War I, it's important that we zero in on one of the many peoples that comprised the Austro-Hungarian Empire, namely the Serbs. In 1914, Austrian Serbs numbered about 2 million, comprising around 4% of the empire's total population. Their small numbers, however, failed to underscore the danger they posed to the empire's security. Unlike Austrian Czechs or Slovaks, Austrian Serbs could point to the existence of an independent Serb nation-state just over the border. This was a relatively recent creation, carved from the declining Ottoman Empire in 1878. But Serb nationalists insisted that all Serbs should belong within a single state. To achieve this aim, Serbian intelligence, led by a mercurial agent known by the code name Opis, funded clandestine organizations like the Black Hand. Members of this Black Hand sought to bring about Serb unity through bombings and assassinations, which were intended to awaken the Serb-speaking people living under Austrian rule. In 1914, the Black Hand targeted the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand during his state visit to Sarajevo, the capital of the recently acquired Austrian province of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Serb nationalists claimed to be part of Greater Serbia. Franz Ferdinand was actually sympathetic to Serb demands for cultural autonomy within the empire, and as heir to the Austrian throne had patronized Serb writers and artists. This actually made him more of a threat to Serb nationalism, at least as far as extremists were concerned, because if the Austrian government treated Serbs with dignity, some Serb speakers may decide that they would rather stay in Austria than join Serbia. Better to provoke full-scale repression, which would then convince moderates to back extremist causes. Black Hand terrorists first threw a grenade at Franz Ferdinand as he drove through Sarajevo that fateful day in 1914, but unfortunately for them, he survived the blast, which wounded several people in the car behind him. The Archduke continued his visit, but then decided to make an unscheduled stop at the hospital, where blast victims were then convalescing. His car stalled along the way, right in front of the cafe in which the teenage Gavrilo Princip, who had earlier been involved in the grenade attack, was eating a sandwich. Princip grabbed his pistol and raced outside, shooting both the Archduke and his wife. Crowds rioted in Vienna as news of the Archduke's death spread, smashing Serb-owned businesses and cafes, but a period of calm mourning soon followed. The elderly Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph, who had been in power since 1848, sought to take advantage of his nephew's death, seeing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to punish Serbia. He dictated a harsh ultimatum, one designed to be refused, that was tantamount to a total surrender by Serbia. Under the terms of the ultimatum, Serbia would not only be required to hand over anyone responsible for the attack, a fairly reasonable request, but would also have to ban any anti-Austrian media and propaganda and allow Austrian inspectors to enforce this measure within the borders of Serbia itself. The Serbs refused and braced for war. But this war would not be limited to Serbia alone. Germany, Austria's ally, pledged to support Franz Joseph. Russia, which saw itself as a defender of Slavic peoples, intervened to defend Serbia. The French and the British, under the terms of the Triple Entente, were obliged to defend Russia in the event of war. World War I, then known as the Great War, was set to begin.